I'd like to thank everyone for coming out to our first pension fund sponsored funding seminar. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Tim McPhillips. I'm a 14-year member of the fire department. I'm serving my first term as a trustee, and I'm currently your fund secretary. The genesis or the impetus of this meeting came from one of my fellow trustees, Peter O'Sullivan. He was very concerned that many of the members were getting conflicting information about the health of the pension fund. That information was coming predominantly from myself, that is a trustee on the pension fund, and other, I guess, stakeholders, I would say probably more local too. Local too and the pension fund have a natural, I guess I would call it a institutional tension, which is natural. Local 2 is designed to go out and get you better benefits, which the pension fund is not against at all. But the pension fund has a fiduciary obligation to all the members, and we need to make sure that those new benefits are funded. So that is where a lot of the institutional tension between the pension fund and Local 2 will derive from. Also, you know, the pension fund has, in their relationship with you, typically a 60-year relationship. From the day you get on the truck, the engine, the ambulance, until the day you retire, that's typically 30 years. And then from the day you retire until, unfortunately, well, the last day you get a check, I'll use that term, that's another 30 years. So for 60 years, when you get your first paycheck and you make that contribution into the pension fund and the city provides an additional funding, we have to look at investing that money for 60 years. Local 2 may have a shorter time frame, or at least they may not understand our time frame. So I think that's another cause of some of the institutional friction between the two groups. So Peter O'Sullivan's view was, let's bring in some of the experts that we talked to. Some of those experts would be our investment consultant, our actuaries that come up with the liabilities, our legal counsel that advise us on our pension code. So that is the genesis for us being here today, and I appreciate everyone coming out. No offense to this audience, but there's a lot of gray hair in the audience, and I think that could be a bit of the problem that we're having at the pension fund. I think the younger members need to be interested and involved and become a vocal stakeholder in the pension fund. So if you have sons, neighbors, co-workers on this job that are younger, I ask you to please encourage them to get involved. So Mary Pat Burns is a partner with Burke, Burns & Pinelli. She has been our legal counsel for as long as I've been here. 15 years? 12 years? Almost 20. Okay. Mary Pat?
As Trustee McPhillips said, I'm one of your lawyers for the pension fund. And if you haven't met me, please feel free to introduce yourselves afterwards. Along with Sarah Bakeman from my office and really my entire firm, we're there all the time to help you if you have any questions with respect to your retirement. Some of you see me at retirement seminars because usually, I think for the last 18 years, I've presented at the seminars. But this morning, what Trustee McPhillips asked us to talk about a little bit is funding. So we're going to talk about funding with the expectation that hopefully it will lead to be a framework that you will then better understand what the actuaries and the investment people are going to tell you, okay? Because sometimes we forget how this works. We're governed, as you know, by this code. And you can see my code looks pretty worn. It's like a Bible. And what people really don't understand about pension funds is that we don't have any power other than the power that's spelled out in the code. So sometimes we want to do things at the pension fund, but we can't because we are limited to what the statute tells us to do. So it's kind of like we're governed by the people down in Springfield. So what I'm going to lay out for you is what the people in Springfield have determined to be the funding mechanism by which your pension benefits are funded. And I think you should be very aware, as Trustee McPhillips said, of the status of funding, and you should, at the end of this, want to follow it for the next 5 to 7, 10 years to see what happens. Because if you don't get the pension funds properly funded, then they won't be there to pay benefits, right? That's just logic, just like at home. Okay, so the first thing is to understand is what the funding prior to 2010. So when I started as the lawyer for the pension fund, the funding was one thing. So for many of you, when you came on the job, how the pension funds were funded was one way. And since 2010, there have been a lot of changes. So that's what we want to kind of educate you on. So historically, what happened was the city of Chicago was required to fund based on a multiplier system. And so for every dollar you contributed, the city contributed 2.26. So basically, there was $3.26 to pay your benefits, times however many dollars you were paid. But that meant that the money that was in the pool, for every dollar you did, they put in 2.26, then that money had to be invested. There are 3 aspects of funding. The employer contributions, right? That's the city's contributions. Your contributions. And then those contributions are invested, and that's we try to make an excess return on your money, and that's what Brady's going to talk about. Those are the 3 things for funding. That's all we have. We have employer contributions, your contributions, investment returns. There's nothing else. There's no, like the state funds have special pools of money that they can pull from that are in the state budget. You don't have any of that. You just have those 3 sources. And what's important to remember is that the multiplier contributions do not adjust according to the actual cost of providing benefits. So you guys, it was what's called a static multiplier. The money went in regardless of what the costs were. So as pension funds and the cost of pensions went up, which is a good thing, right? Because people were living longer and there were 3% COLAs. But as those costs went up, the benefit, what payments were going level. And so there's obviously a big deficit. That's what happened. That's when you hear the term unfunded liability. That's the problem. The static multiplier was not sufficient to actually pay for what it cost to give you your benefits. And the deficit just kept growing and growing and growing. And what you're going to hear from Brady is you cannot invest your way out of it because the discrepancy was so large that you can't get, you guys know from your own portfolios what's your return. If you're lucky, if you get a 4% return, 5% return every year, and the deficits were a hell of a lot larger than 4 or 5%. So what does that, kind of leads? It leads to kind of a joke about these are your tax-free years, make the most of them. I mean, these are the times when you guys should not be worrying about stuff, and instead, I think you need to be. Okay, so the funding, the multiplier system simply didn't work. It would have worked in an economy if everything stayed the same, but, that's just not reality. So in December of 2010, Governor Quinn signed into legislation what we call 1495. And you guys might remember 1495. I'm sure the union, Local 2, was talking about it a lot. But what that did is it created a new tier of pension benefits for public safety employees if you were hired on or after January 1, 2011. So nobody in this room, I don't think, was hired after January 1, 2011, right? Everybody's before that, or are you a Tier 2? Okay, we have one Tier 2. But Tier 2 benefits are significantly less than Tier 1 benefits unless you're a widow of a Tier 2 benefit. Then you actually get a better benefit, which makes no sense. But under 1495, what happened was the city, Mayor Daley at the time, they decided to change the contributions for the City of Chicago funding. What they did in 2010 is they said, okay, Mr. Mayor, we know that the contributions from the employees and the contributions from the employer are not enough to pay for the benefit. The unfunded liability is growing at a rapid rate. So here's what you're going to have to do, Mr. Mayor. you're going to have to start paying for these pensions. We can't put it off any further. And so what the city and the legislature agreed to, and I think Local 2 was probably very helpful in this, is they agreed that beginning in 2015, they were going to annually levy a tax upon all property within the city of Chicago that would produce an amount of money necessary to pay three things, or two things really. The normal cost of the pension benefits plus an amount sufficient to bring the total assets of the pension fund up to 90% funded by the end of fiscal year 2040. So that should have made you extremely happy when that passed, right? Because what it's saying is, okay, for many, many years, we weren't paying enough money to pay for your benefits. But now we're going to adopt a formula where every year we're going to add to the money so that by 2040, your pension fund would have been 90% funded. And you're going to hear when you're 90% funded, that allows you to invest a hell of a lot more money, right? And if the markets are on a run, like they are now, you would have made a hell of a lot more money for the pension fund. And as my dad used to say, pension funds are never overfunded. It's just the members are underbenefited. So if we made more money, we would have been able to have more money to be able to give benefits, because you can only give benefits if the money's there. Okay, so when that happened, what the city was going to do essentially was give to the Chicago Fire Pension Fund what we call ARC funding. Now you should know that ARC funding, which is the actuarially required contribution, not that complicated, ARC funding. It's complicated how the actuary figures it out, but for a simple person like me, all it meant was whatever they needed to pay my benefit over the next 30, 40 years, that money would be there when I retired. Okay, so that's a good thing. We were all really happy. But what happened was that was going to start beginning in 2015, right? They gave the mayor a little bit of wiggle room so he could get his house in order to be able to start levying property taxes. Well, lo and behold, in 2016, right before the mayor was supposed to start levying the property taxes for the ARC funding, they passed Senate Bill 777. Now, 777 is kind of humorous to me because, as I'll tell you later, that's the bill that ended up being the casino bill. So I think it's kind of funny that they would name it 777, but they tell me that wasn't intentional. It was just sort of, just some sort of a coincidence, but I don't believe it. And basically what this bill did was this bill said, okay, Mr. Mayor, we know you agreed to pay actuarially required funding, but we understand you can't do that right now. And we know you told us you'd start doing that in 2015, but now we're not going to do that. Instead, what the city and the legislature agreed to is that they would defer making the funding contributions. They would no longer agree to do it the way they said they'd do it in 2010. Instead, what they're going to do is they're going to give you another static amount. And we already talked about that. Static amounts aren't really good because they don't really deal with reality. Reality would be ARC funding. Whatever you need gets funded. Now it's a static amount for 5 years called a ramp. And so for the next 5 years, or 2016, instead of giving us the actuarially required contribution, what the city levied and gave us in property taxes at the pond, they gave us $199 million. Now that means that if the benefits that year cost $220 million, we have a deficit, right? Just simple math. The next year, in 2017, they're giving us $208 million. And then next year, they're giving us $227, $235, $245. So what they effectively did was they got like another loan. Instead of having to pay us in 2015, the mayor was able to get 5 more years, but he was paying us a specific amount every year. And then beginning in 2021, the mayor's supposed to contribute beginning on an actuarial basis so that we're 90% funded, Now, remember before we were supposed to be 90% funded by 2040. Now we're going to be 90% funded by 2055. So he bought some time, right, for the city. So that makes it easier for property tax payers. They can spread it out over a longer period of time. And he bought himself another 5 years to work out the details. Now, 777, as I mentioned, also provides that in the event there's a casino, and that hasn't happened yet, but in the event there's a casino, that proceeds received from that casino, assuming the city makes money on that, would be go towards your police and fire pension funds. But that won't give you more money. All that would do is drop what the property tax holders had to give you, because it doesn't add to the bottom line. It just defers how the bottom line gets paid. Now, there are other things in that bill, but it really, they gave you a couple remedies, and you may have heard about that in case the city doesn't pay. But that's really, in my mind, not what's important to funding. What's important to funding is that as you sit here today, you know that, for the young guys in the back, you're not going to be 90% funded to 2055, whereas it would have been a hell of a lot better if we were funded by 2040. But that's just reality. That's what happened. And you have to, I think about whether or not, if it got changed in 2010 to bump it to 2015, from 2010 to 2015, and then in 2016 it got bumped to 2022, do you have to worry that maybe in or about 2020 or 2021 it might get bumped a little further, right? Because it seems to be pretty easy for the legislature to keep rolling this along. Something to think about. Now, again, because the city contributions are static, like they used to be in the old days, the city doesn't adjust due to the funding needs. So we're going to remain, your pension fund's going to remain underfunded, significantly underfunded, for at least the next 5 years, if nothing changes, and then it'll start its upward trend to be 90% funded. The other thing that the bill did, which was kind of scary, and Alex maybe can address what the implication of this is the bill changed the actuarial method that was used. It went from like a unit cost method to a entry age normal cost. And he can tell you whether that means anything, but if they change something, my guess is it benefits the city rather than the pension fund, right? More neutral. Okay. So that's one change. And the second change that they made in the bill, if you look at 777, and it's the most troubling aspect of the bill to me from a legal perspective, and I can explain why later, is that it subordinated your payments to bond payments. So you know what that means is any monies that come in that should go to the pension fund that you could get from the state, like so the state holds money, it gave you a mandamus action. It said, hey, we understand we're putting off funding for another 5 years, but don't worry about it, firefighters, because if the city doesn't pay you the amounts owed, you can sue the state and have the comptroller give you whatever monies, intercept whatever monies the city's going to get to make sure you get paid. And so that seemed like, for a lot of union guys and a lot of rank and file guys, that seemed like a really good benefit because we never had that before. It allowed us to go, remember how I told you that unlike the state funds, you guys only could get money from the city or your contributions? This gave us another bucket of money. The state gives the city money, and if the city didn't pay us, we could go to the state and intercept the city's money. So that seemed like a really good kind of tool, but then they sort of took it away in 777 and said, well, we'll give you the money, firefighters and policemen, but it's first we pay all the bondholders. And that's going to be important because basically the city has so much debt, there would never be any money left over to give it to you. So that they gave us the tool, but they kind of boxed us in where it doesn't mean anything. Okay, so the next slide just kind of compares the language so you can see how it changed from the normal cost plus an annual amount over to the static multiplier again. And what that leads to is the next slide is kind of what the effect it has on the funding level. And what you'll see is that because we didn't start the 90% funding, here's how we end up. This is our current percent funded. You can see it's critical because in 2011, we were 28.43% funded. You know, what's prudent, I think Alex is going to tell you, is we should be 90% funded. Now, some people disagree and say, hey, pension funds can be 70% funded because there's always new members making contributions and, you know, but you should never be 23% funded. And you guys are down to 21.30% funded. So you don't, I mean, that means for every dollar you have to spend, you only have 21 cents. Your funding's going down at a time when funding is going like this, when it needs to go like this. Does that make sense? Okay, so you might think to yourself, given that funding scenario, why the hell isn't the pension fund raising every argument they can? Why aren't they screaming from the rooftop saying, where the hell is our funding? And the reason is because there's all these cases out there that kind of box us in. And one of the cases is Skladowski. And Skladowski was in 1998, but under Illinois law, there's still this thing called precedent, and we have to kind of rely on the cases. You can't just kind of get rid of them. And what Skladowski says is that even though the city has to pay your pensions, you have a constitutional right not to have your pension be diminished or impaired, but you don't have a right to funding. You can't force the city to pay you. So it's kind of like weird, because you've got the right to pay, but you don't have the right to a specific level of funding. So even though we at the pension fund would like to be 90% funded, the law says we can't do anything about it. We don't have the tool to force the city to pay more. So that's the first thing Skladowski did. And you can see the last line. It says, Skladowski stated that annuitants are not entitled to a particular funding mechanism, and that unless the plaintiffs, in that case, judges and various people who sued, unless they can show that the funds are on the verge of default or imminent bankruptcy. So that's kind of what we at the pension fund do. When we meet, we're always looking, hey, are we on the verge of imminent default or bankruptcy? Because that's the point when the pension funds can sue. Up till then, Skladowski in these cases say we can't sue the city for funding. Okay, now, in the next one, there was litigation brought by fund members regarding funding, right? So most recently, the Supreme Court, the Illinois Supreme Court, said that, again, the specifics of funding are left to the city, but a direct action could be brought by a system member to compel funding if a pension fund were on the verge of default or imminent bankruptcy. So here again is this phrase, 1998, it was in that Skladowski case. Fast forward to 2016, it's in the Supreme Court case, same language, saying the only way you can compel funding is if a member brought an action, and a member can bring an action only if it can prove that a pension system is on the verge of default or imminent bankruptcy. And so for many years, you know, Sarah, I, other pension lawyers, we're like, what the hell does that mean? Like, what does it mean to be on the verge of default or imminent bankruptcy for the city of Chicago? And I think that that's a really good question. Most recently, just a couple months ago, a court for the first time defined what does it mean to be on the verge of default or imminent bankruptcy. And you may have heard about this case. How many have heard about the Harvey case? The Harvey case is really the first one. And what happened in this case is the pension fund did file against the city of Harvey and its city council, saying that the city had failed to comply with Article 4 of the pension code, in that it failed to properly fund the pension fund. And it did make the argument that the city of Harvey's pension fund was on the verge of default and bankruptcy. Now, it's interesting because the pension fund is not bankrupt, and it kept paying its firefighters. It wasn't like it was missing a payment. But it still said, hey, we think we're on the verge of bankruptcy because we're not sure that we'll last more than 5 years. And actually, for the, like in the city, the municipal fund, the Municipal Employees Annuity and Benefit Fund, which I also represent, that fund also has a 5-year, and then it's going to go bankrupt. So it's interesting to think that that might be the first fund of the city that files a lawsuit like Harvey. So the Harvey Pension Fund thought they had 5 years left based on an actuarial calculation, and so at that point, the pension fund moved to see if they could compel funding. And I'll tell you, to get to the end of the story, they succeeded. So the city is going to have to fund the Harvey Pension Fund by law. Now, a court's ordering them to do it. But here's what the city of Harvey did that was different than us. The city of Harvey, like the city of Chicago, before they changed the law, was required to make actuarially based funding contributions. The members continued to pay the same amount, but Harvey was supposed to pay an actuarially required amount necessary to pay for the pensions. And so you can see what they were required, I don't know, that's kind of a bad slide, but what they were required to contribute versus I showed you what they did contribute. So for example, in 2014, the city was supposed to contribute $2,070,000, and they only contributed $600,000. In 2013, they were supposed to contribute $2 million. They contributed $0 from the city, and they ended up, you could see their percentage of what they paid, very low percentages. In contrast, if you look at what the city of Chicago pays for your pension fund, you can see that even under Senate Bill 777, which puts off our 90% funding for 5 or 10 years, but look what it does. It still pays a very high percentage of what we actually need. So if you go back to the prior slide, where Harvey was only making contributions of 0% that was needed, or 28%, and then you look at this slide, you can see the city's contributing 80% of what we need, 73%, 77%, so very high numbers. So we're not Harvey. You know, you don't have to worry as much as the people in Harvey had to worry, because the city, even though it's giving us a static amount, is giving you a significant amount. It's not what we want, but it's a hell of a lot better than people like in Harvey. Now, the problem is, if you look at the next slide, is that Harvey, it looks the same as us, and I could see where people would say, hey, why aren't we just like Harvey? Why isn't the pension fund filing a lawsuit? Because Harvey was 27.18% funded, and you're only 23% funded, right? So if Harvey filed when they were only 27% funded, and we're 23, why aren't we filing? But the problem is we're not on the verge of bankruptcy or imminent default. We're getting 75% of the money we need. So you got to keep that in mind if you're panicking. The city of Harvey did a lot of things that weren't appropriate for the pension fund. They bonded money for pension payments and then used the money to buy machinery and trucks and different things. So don't think that our factual situation is like Harvey, because it really isn't. You don't need to worry as much. But what's important is that the court did go in and say, hey, what does it mean to be imminently on the verge of default or imminent bankruptcy? And they also made it clear for the first time that maybe you do have a right to funding, a constitutional right to funding. So that's why that case is important. And trust us, we're watching it, and if we get to the point where we think we have a cause of action for funding, you know, I'm sure the pension fund trustees would consider that. So really, that's sort of what the Harvey case did and how it put it for the first time, telling us what it meant to be on the verge of bankruptcy. There were a number of factors where they had less than 5 years of money. Harvey showed no intent to fund it in a regular manner. Again, not like the city of Chicago. The city of Chicago's been making their payments. Also, with Harvey, the mayor and the consultants all took the position that they didn't need to fund it. They could do it on a pay-as-you-go system. More money in, as soon as it comes in, they pay it out. And the court didn't like that, because the court said, basically, we're using active money, active members' contributions to pay retired benefits for retirees. And that's where the court was like, no, we're going to step in and we're going to order the city to levy a property tax that's going to be sufficient to get the pension fund to full funding. So that's what happened in Harvey. I doubt it'll happen in Chicago, but now we know we have the tool to do it if we need to do it, which is really good. Okay, so what can you do going forward? I think you got to do a lot of things. One thing you have to do is you have to make sure that you and Local 2, through your representatives, monitor legislation. Because this stuff is always changing, and they change, and you hear a snippet of what the legislation says, and you really don't understand all of the consequences that go on. I think you always have to remember that if you can't remember anything else, what you always want to tell your legislative representatives in your districts or any of the people you know who are down in Springfield, you want ARC funding, ARC funding, ARC funding. And what that means is that you'll get the funding necessary to pay your benefits, whatever the cost is. All of the state pension funds have that, and that's why they're all 60, 70% funded. The reason you guys are 20% funded is because you don't have ARC funding, because ARC funding is necessary to get the fund healthy again. The other thing I think you have to be careful about is whenever these benefits come up that sound good and you want them and you deserve them, you got to remember there has to be a funding source for them. And Sarah's going to talk a little bit about health care and what's going on with the health care litigation, because we know how important it is for everybody to have health care. But the reality is that's not a benefit that's funded. So when the pension fund pays health care, it basically takes money away from the fund that's not been contributed, and therefore you can't invest that money to make more money, and there's more of a chance of that money not being there to pay your pension benefits. And lastly, I think that what you have to do, and the most serious kind of threat to the funding of the pension fund, is that someday there being legislation that would allow the city or the pension fund to go bankrupt. And that's what's called a Chapter 9 bankruptcy, a municipal bankruptcy. What happened earlier in litigation that we were involved with, and the pension fund we were all successful with, is the city tried to argue that they do not have to pay all the benefits. Only the pension fund has to pay the benefits. And if the pension fund ran out of money, the city would just be able to kind of look to the pension fund. And we said, hell no. That's not the deal. We only administer the pension fund. The city's responsible for the benefit, and the court agreed with us. The court said, no, Mr. City, you have to pay these benefits. We don't tell you how to fund the benefits, but you have to pay them. So that's a big victory for us at the pension fund. But the mayor still has the opportunity, if the law changes, to go bankrupt. And I think that that's ultimately maybe on the table for the city. I don't know. I can't speak for them. But I could see where someday a mayor might want to allow a pension fund to go bankrupt. To do that, he'd have to change the law in Springfield. But what we know, anyone who's been reading the papers, is over the last 10 years, or 12 years, 3 cities have filed for bankruptcy. Stockton, California, San Bernardino, California, and Detroit, Michigan. And what was the first thing that got involved when a municipality files for bankruptcy? Pension benefits. Not just for firemen, for all municipal employees. So right now, under our law today, there is no ability for the mayor to file for bankruptcy. But that change could come in a bill that you guys wouldn't even look at, right? Because it wouldn't be a pension bill. It would be a municipal finance bill. And we have a governor in Springfield who happens to think that municipalities and local governments should have the ability to go bankrupt. Right now, people are fighting that. But you need to watch that because it won't come in a pension bill. So it's not a bill that necessarily Local 2 or the pension fund would be looking for. It would come sort of from the sidelines. And if the city got the ability to file for bankruptcy, what would happen is that immediately, based on San Bernardino, Stockton, Detroit, what happens is pension benefits, as I said, are the first thing that they look at to cut, freeze, or diminish, okay? The other thing you have to think about, and what kind of bubbling, sometimes you see it in the papers, is having another constitutional convention. Right now, under the Constitution, your pension benefits can't be diminished or impaired. Diminished means they can't take something away and say, for instance, we thought we'd give you a 3% COLA, now we're not going to do that. We're going to give you a 0% COLA. That's diminished. Impaired means they can't pay you. That's the bankruptcy thing we've been talking about, the funding. But if you go bankrupt, what courts have held is that it's a contract, and that contract can be changed in the bankruptcy proceeding, right? So they'll change the contract. And so if the Constitution, the other way they'll do it is the constitutional amendment. They're talking about going in and trying to freeze benefits. Now, I don't think they can do that going backwards, but they might be able to do it going forward, which would be something that for younger members you should be very alert to, okay? I guess we're going to take questions to the end, right? Okay, so you might have some questions about actual funding, and we're happy to answer those. Sarah's going to take a few minutes to, she's been handling this, the ongoing saga of Underwood and Korshak, which are the healthcare cases. And so she's just going to update you briefly so you have an understanding of how that fits into funding. Because as we talked about, we're only 20% funded, and now we're going to be asked probably to do some healthcare information.
My name is Sarah, and I have the privilege of working with Mary Pat as one of your attorneys for the pension fund. As Mary Pat said, I'm just going to briefly talk about healthcare litigation and how it relates specifically to what we're talking about today with funding. So as many of you probably know, this healthcare litigation has a long and tortured history. It's almost as old as I am, in fact. And it all stems from litigation that was filed in 1987, which we refer to as the Korshak litigation. And what had happened is prior to 1987, the city had traditionally covered retirees, such as yourself, under one of its self-insured plans. So up until 1987, the city was covering you, paying the cost of such coverage. And then in 1987, the city actually sued the funds and said, you know what, we're no longer going to provide this coverage, we're no longer going to pay for it. This is a fund benefit, and it should be provided by the fund. And the reason they did that is they based it on a 1983 amendment that was in the pension code. I know Mary Pat talked a little bit about how important this code is to us, and it is because the pension fund does all things out of this document. So we have no independent authority. We operate under this document and what the courts tell us to do with this document. So in 1987, the city sued the funds and said, we're no longer providing health care, that's on the funds. And the funds countersued and said, no, the city has provided this is a city benefit, and that was the Korshak litigation. So stemming from the Korshak litigation, there was a series of settlement agreements, and those settlement agreements were codified in the pension code. So for a period of about 10 to 15 years, the parties kept entering into settlement agreements so that you could continue that coverage through the city and that the city would pay a set percentage of that premium. So at the expiration of those settlement agreements, the city sent out a letter in 2013 and said the settlement agreements are about to expire. We're reiterating what we said in 1987. We're no longer going to provide health care coverage, and we're no longer going to subsidize it. Now, there was an exception in that letter. They said they would continue to cover and subsidize two groups, and those are the Korshak and the Windows subclasses. Those are annuitants who retired and entered the system prior to 1987, that they would continue to cover those. But everyone else was out of luck. So when the city sent out that letter, Mr. Krisloff, who's an attorney, and a group of annuitants initiated a new lawsuit, which Mary Pat mentioned. That's the Underwood litigation. And so that's what's been kind of going on in the court since 2013. So here we are in 2017. Mr. Krisloff filed that Underwood lawsuit saying the city needs to provide, he sued both the city and the funds, so the funds are actually a defendant in that lawsuit. But the real fight there is with the cities to say, hey, you need to continue to provide this health care coverage that you've promised these individuals. And then he also sued the funds under those two amendments. So it bounced around a little bit in circuit court. There was eventually a circuit court ruling that was appealed to the appellate court. So the most recent ruling that we have has been from the appellate court. And what the appellate court said was that annuitants, retirees, have no rights to any of those, the benefits that were provided in those settlement agreements that were codified in the pension code, because they were all time limited. They said you would receive this coverage up to a certain date. But the appellate court said, but the subsidies that are provided in that 1983 amendment don't have an expiration date, and the funds and the cities are obligated to follow what's stated in that 1983 amendment. So that's where the case is currently. That's what the appellate court said, that 1983 amendment is what we're focused on. And in that 1983 amendment, just so you're aware, it says that the funds are responsible for paying on behalf of annuitants up to a maximum of $55 per month if the annuitant is qualified to receive Medicare, and up to $21 per month if the annuitant is qualified for Medicare. So it's a pretty small subsidy amount. It is not the increased benefit that was included in those successor amendments. It's a pretty small benefit. But that's currently what we're looking at, is that 1983 amendment. And that's what the appellate court was focused on. Now, Mr. Krisloff has appealed that appellate court ruling to this. He's filed a petition for leave to appeal in the Supreme Court, because he is still arguing that's not enough. The 1983 benefit is not enough. It's what those successor amendments and what the city was providing in those successor amendments is what should be continue to be provided to annuitants. So Mr. Krisloff has filed a PLA in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court actually has to accept that, so we're kind of waiting to hear if the Supreme Court is going to take the case. They could refuse to take the case. So that's where we are right now with the litigation. But to kind of tie it back into what Mary Pat said, what does this have to do with funding? Well, you'll recall that Mary Pat mentioned that right now we're in this ramp period where the pension fund is getting a static number from the city. That's not going up and it's not going down. They're required to give us that static number. And the issue with the static number, similar to the multiplier, is it's not adjusted for benefits, increased benefits that might come. So with respect to health care and the benefit that I just mentioned in that 83 amendment, that subsidy, even though it seems like it's a small subsidy, that is a benefit, a subsidy benefit that the fund would potentially be responsible for paying that is not funded. So especially on that last slide where one of the things that Mary Pat said is we need to be wary and cautious and be on alert for benefits that are provided that don't have a simultaneous funding stream. This is one of those instances. Healthcare benefit and what's provided under the 83 amendment is not simultaneously funded. So it's something that we need to be on alert and looking at, especially during this ramp period. And I know you probably all have a lot of questions, because I know this healthcare litigation is crazy, and it seems like there's a new appeal every week, and we're running into court every other week, and I know there's a lot going on with it. And like I said, the litigation is almost as old as I am, so there's a lot of history here, so I apologize for kind of blowing through it. But I just really wanted to emphasize that what the courts are really focused on right now is that 1983 amendment that talks about a subsidy level of up to $55 per month if you're not qualified to receive Medicare, and up to $21 per month if you are qualified. And like I said, especially during this ramp period, there's no simultaneous funding for it. So Mary Pat mentioned in 2016, we got $199 million, 2017, 204, 2018, 227. If and when we have to pay that subsidy, it's coming out of that amount. It's not, we don't get anything extra from the city.
The next two speakers, let me kind of preface maybe the framework of how to view this. We're generally 20% funded. I think officially it's 21.3, Alex, is that correct, at the end of 2016? So what that means is for every dollar of benefits that have already been earned and you're entitled to, we have 20 cents to pay for it. Very simple fraction. You have investments up on top, that's the numerator. Approximately $1 billion we have in assets, and the benefits that have been earned are approximately $5 billion. So the 1 to 5 gets you your 20% funding ratio. So Alex will speak to the actuary, will speak to the denominator, which is the benefits that we have earned and how those are calculated. and some of the drivers that impact that calculation. Brady, our investment consultant, he will speak to the numerator, which is the investments, the assets we have to pay those benefits. I think you will hear Brady say that we are not going to invest our way out of this to increase that numerator of the ratio. Although investments will help, predominantly it will come from more contributions from the city, preferably. Our next speaker is Alex Rivera. He is a partner at GRS, our actuary.
I'm Alex Rivera, and I've served the pension board and plan members for roughly 15 years, so I have a significant amount of experience with this plan. So today I'm just going to go briefly over the actuarial valuation process and how it impacts the measurement of the financial health of this system. So on the first slide, what is an actuarial valuation and why do we need it? Well, in actuarial valuation, you've heard this comment about funded ratio, actuarial liabilities and assets, and it's really a scorecard of the level of assets needed to finance a pension system. So we're most concerned with seeing a reasonable growth in the funded ratio. So in other words, are assets accumulating at a sufficient rate to keep up with the growth in liabilities? And how do liabilities grow? Well, liabilities grow as a person reaches retirement. So when a person or a firefighter first enters the plan, there's no actuarial liability. Okay, when a firefighter first enters the system, there is no liability. Every year, as they earn credits, pension credits, the liability increases gradually until they reach retirement. Under a sound system, it's preferable to have assets accumulate in line with the growth in liabilities. So typically, that would happen over a 30-year period. So that's kind of the background of why we need to keep track of an actuarial liability. Now, in general, how is evaluation used? Well, I mentioned the comparison of liabilities to assets. The second is that there needs to be some type of mechanism to calculate contributions that are accumulating. Those are generally determined by statute, and we'll go over the formulas that are used to determine those contributions. The third one, why do we need a scorecard for liabilities and assets? The third one, and this is what the city is most interested in, it's plan accounting. So on the city's financial statement, they need to report the funded status on their accounting reports. And that's important because the bond rating agencies look at that measurement. How healthy are the plans? And that could influence the bond rating of the city. The other key component is the tax levy. So the city is concerned with the target contribution because, again, that will impact their tax levy. Now, the last two bullets in our valuation, we also include a history of the funding progress. So is the plan or are assets growing at a sufficient rate to reach a targeted funded ratio? So we're looking at the history to project into the future. And then the last part of our analysis is we're projecting assets and liabilities to assess whether or not the current plan for funding is sufficient. Now, these actuarial valuations, we need to abide by what's called actuarial standards of practice. So we can't use assumptions that are aggressive. You know, we have to be able to support all of our assumptions that we include in the valuation. So that's critical. If we use assumptions that cannot be supported, it really does no good for the plan members, the city, or other stakeholders. So we have to abide by what's called actuarial standards of practice. Now let's flip to the next page. Now, what's considered a sound actuarial funding policy? And Trustee McPhillips mentioned that the typical career of a firefighter, it's basically 30 years. So they may enter, let's say, at age 27 or so, retire at 57. So in a good funding model, it's really preferable to accumulate assets during their working career so that when they retire at age 57, there are enough benefits in the trust to cover expected benefit payments for that member. So this is generally done through a pooling mechanism. So on average, when the person retires, again, there are enough assets to pay their benefits. And as I mentioned earlier, benefits are growing as a function of the normal cost, or the liability is growing as a function of the normal cost. So every year they earn an increment of benefits, and they accumulate until the member retires. Another consideration is that if there are benefit improvements during the member's working lifetime, there needs to be some way of financing those improvements. If they're not financed and the financing is delayed, that puts additional strain on the pension system. So that's another key consideration, is that benefit improvements, that there's a direct mechanism to finance those benefits. The next point is that in a sound policy, there also needs to be a way of adjusting contributions for experience. So in other words, in our model, we're assuming that plan assets in the long run will earn roughly 7.5% per year. If that bogey is not reached, if assets do not earn 7.5 in the long run, then adjustments need to be made to the actuarially based contributions, and that would imply an increase in contributions. In our model, we also make assumptions about how much a member is expected to earn in additional salary. So if our model is off, for example, if salaries are higher than expected, then that would imply additional contributions from the city. Thirdly, if a member lives longer and receives more pension checks, that's a loss to the system, and that would imply additional contributions from the city. Now, this last point is important. I think Mary Pat and Trustee McPhillips alluded to it, that in a solid financial plan for a retirement system, it's important that the majority of benefits are paid with investment income and not contributions. So if the majority of benefits are paid with contributions, that implies that the fund is not growing at an appropriate rate. And I have some graphs towards the end of the presentation that shows the relationship. So the current statutory policy, it does allow a greater proportion of benefits to be paid with investment income, but it's going to take some time before that actually happens. So let's see, Mary Pat went over a lot of this information as far as the statutory funding policy. But the key takeaway here is that the city's contributions are increasing from about $200 million for 2016 to about $245 million for 2020. And then in order to get to 90% funding by 2055, in our model, that number spikes up from $245 million to $345 million. So that's almost a gap of $100 million in increased contributions for the city in 2021. So that number could change depending on how the markets do over the next 4 to 5 years. So if the market does not perform well, that $340 million target will increase. Conversely, if the markets do very well, that number would be lower. And then there are other factors in our actuarial model. For example, the pattern of how members retire, for example. So if during the next 4 to 5 years more firefighters retire than expected in our model, we'll see a spike or an increase in contribution. So we monitor that experience every year for the next 4 to 5 years to evaluate the $340 million target. Now, if the city makes that contribution consistently, the $340 million adjusted with inflation, wage inflation, and also actuarial experience, including investments, then the plan would be 90% funded by 2055. Now, we have a few concerns with this policy, and earlier I mentioned that it's preferable to finance retirement benefits over the working lifetime of a firefighter. So in our model, that's roughly 30 years. This model extends it a little longer. So by stretching the period to reach 90%, we're putting more risk on the system, but that's how the policy was set. But in our opinion, a target of 2045 would have been preferable. Now, the other changes that were recently made were COLAs were extended to members born before 66. That put strain or pressure on the retirement system. Those benefits are being funded through the 90% target. Again, the key here is at 2022 or so, the city is on target to make contributions of about 65% of pay. Okay, on the next slide, we have the scorecard. So as of our most recent valuation, the actuarial liability is roughly $5 billion. Assets are a little north of $1 billion. The unfunded liability is roughly $4 billion. And the funded ratio is 21%. The city's contribution, which is fixed for 2017, is $227 million, and that compares to our actuarially determined contribution of $337 million. Now, what is the actuarially determined contribution? Mary Pat mentioned this also as the ARC. Well, we estimate that number to be the normal costs plus a 30-year amortization of the unfunded actuarial liability. And that's roughly $337 million. All right, let's go to the next slide. So let's look at the very last column, 2055. In 2055, roughly $526 million will be earned in investment income. Now that's the projection, and it's a long-term projection, but based on our model, the fund would earn roughly $526 million in investment income. The city's contribution would be in the neighborhood of $554 million, and benefits would be in the neighborhood of roughly $600 million. So at 2055, the funding policy is in place and it's working what I would consider properly. So there's enough growth in assets. There's a good proportion of investment income relative to contributions, relative to benefit payments. So it's roughly benefit payments of $600 million, contributions of $500 million, investment income of $526 million, and then there's a little sliver for member contributions. So that's what I would consider a very healthy position to be in, but it's going to take a while. So let's look at, for comparison, 2022. In 2022, city contributions are roughly $348 million. Investment income is roughly $112 million. And benefit payments and expenses are in the neighborhood of just south of $400 million. So in that case, investment income really isn't part of the equation. And I think Brady is going to mention that right now, the system cannot invest its way out of this funding concern, 20% funded. It's going to take contributions. So the bottom bar shows the city's contribution. The top bar shows investment income. So it's going to take a good 15 to 20 years before investment income becomes a major component of the financing of the fund. On the next page, we compare the actuarial liabilities to assets. So the bars are assets, the top line, the red line, that's the liability line. So you can see there's a huge gap between assets and liabilities, and the gap really doesn't start to shrink until probably 2040. So that's not a good relationship. That tells us that the contribution policy is backloaded. In other words, the financial health of the plan doesn't really occur until later in the projection process. But at 2055, if the city continues to make contributions as scheduled, then the plan would be at 90% funded. Now, as retirees, I don't think you should necessarily be alarmed about the funded ratio being so low right now. I think what is critical is that the city stays on track to making those contributions. So at 2022 or so, that $350 million contribution, that is critical. And a plan to continue to make those contributions. Again, that is critical to the financial health of the plan. Now, on the next page, we show the same relationship, but just in terms of the funded ratio. So at 2040 or so, the funded ratio is in the neighborhood of 42, 43%. And then at that point, it really starts to increase.
All right, good morning. So I am with a firm called Callan, and we provide investment advice to institutional investors. So the Firemen's Annuity and Benefit Fund, we work with the Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund, Chicago Teachers, and the Cook County Annuity and Benefit Fund. The previous two speakers have really done me a great favor this morning and shortened what I was going to say, so they've also done you a good favor. The message you heard was, in light of the lack of contributions that have come into the fund, that 21% funded, you can't really improve that by doing a really good job on your investment portfolio. So Trustee McPhillips said, you've got about $1 in liabilities, 20 cents in assets. Let's say we do an extraordinary job on the investment portfolio and earn 50%. It gives you 30 cents on the dollar. So then you're only 30% funded. So it's a really unique challenge. It's and I say unique because this is really a situation that's not common throughout the public pension world. When we work in different states that have different funding mechanisms, this challenge isn't there. So what do we do in light of this challenge? What do the trustees do trying to make a decision on how to invest the portfolio if we say the contributions, the money coming in from the city is really what's going to save you? Well, you can do one of two things, really. You can say, okay, the investment portfolio is important. Let's put it in a relatively safe investment. Maybe let's invest in some index funds and wait for that money from the city to come in. So that's one alternative. What the plan has been doing and what we decided to keep on doing was to continue to try our very best to earn as much as we can with that 20 cents on the dollar that we have. So here on page 3, we just have a snapshot of what the pension fund trustees have articulated as their investment portfolio. It's diversified. We're invested in U.S. stocks. We're invested in bonds, real estate, stocks of foreign companies, international equities. We've got some cash and alternative investments, and that's mostly private equity. So we're doing the best we can with the small amount of assets that we have, but no matter how good we do, we really can't fight the circumstances, so it's really living to fight another day, essentially. On page 4, if we turn to the next slide, yep. So if you look back at how the pension fund has done for the past 5 years, we've earned an annualized return of 9.99% on a gross fee basis. So almost 10% every year for the past 5 years. And that was good enough to put you ahead of 85% of all the other public pension investors out there. So normally that would be a really good result, but as I said before, and as you've heard earlier, regardless of how well we do on an investment return basis, our long-term viability is really going to be determined by that money coming in from the city. So we recently did a detailed study where we looked at these projections from Alex. We made our own estimate of what different investments will do, what you can earn from stocks, what you can earn from bonds. And we said, one, there's some good news here. So I don't want this to be too bad, but we said the cash outflows, benefit payments going to many of you in this room, relative to the cash coming in, is not so out of whack that it limits your ability to invest in higher returning asset classes. So there was a point in time where we said, geez, you might have to think about not being a long-term investor, but being a checking fund. So investing all in cash rather than stocks, private equity, real estate, things that earn higher rates of return. So the good news is you could continue to be a long-term investor and you could invest in illiquid investments. So things that you can't sell right away, but because of that, they give you a little higher bit of return for your dollar. So that's really the silver lining on the investment portfolio is despite how bad the starting point is, if the contribution level is stuck to, and Tim, maybe we could go to the next one if you would. This is the big if. So this is a similar picture to what Alex has shown, and it speaks to what Mary Pat had articulated as well, the contributions coming into the plan. Now, our advice to the plan was very much contingent upon this legislation staying in place. And if 5 years from now, when that line goes up and the contribution level goes from being somewhat modest to a more significant spike, and there's legislation to effectively kick the can down the road, then we need to revisit the investment portfolio once again because the circumstances have changed. Now, this may look similar. When I looked at this, it struck me like an adjustable rate mortgage. So if you're familiar with home ownership, there are adjustable rate mortgages that give you a low rate for maybe 5 years. And then after that 5 years, you get used to having a nice low mortgage rate. It may kick up to a higher level and you have to do something. You either have to pay that higher mortgage rate or you have to refinance. And effectively what the city has been doing is refinancing. But presuming they stick to this, it will be a rather bleak 20 or 30 years on the path to 90% funded by 2055, but we will get there. So wrapping it up and reinforcing the importance of getting those contributions, but from my perspective as somebody who doesn't deal with getting the money from the city, I just come in when you've got the money. Having adequate contributions is critical to the long-term health of a plan. So Mary Pat had referred to some of these numbers, and I looked them up. If you look across the country at all the public pension plans, all the revenues and benefit payments that have gone out to people that are members of a pension plan, about 63%, close to 2/3 of every dollar that is paid to public retirees comes from investment earnings. About 25% of that, a quarter, comes from employer contributions, so money from the city. And about 12% is contributions that come from the employees. So contributions in total about a third, and investment earnings are over 60%. Now, the tricky thing about that is if you have such a low funding level, there's no money on which to earn additional returns. So those plans that we work with that are close to full funding, and there are some pension plans across the country that have 90% or more of the assets, what's marked them as being successful is not the fact that they've had really better investment returns than you have, but they've had a mechanism that has required the plan sponsor, whoever provides for the pension fund, to put in that actuarial required contribution, the ARC, every single year without fail. There's no contribution holidays or other ways of deferring payment. So really, the funding mechanism is what's critical. And when we think about the investment portfolio, again, we're going to do our best to make every single dollar that we can with what we have. But the fact is, to have enough to reach that 90% funded by 2055, we need to make sure that there's money that comes in according to the plan. And if that plan changes, we're going to have another discussion with the trustees about what we might do. Because that investment returns can't be the savior here. It's really waiting for the city and the contributions to come in as they've projected.